The way of Jesus is the way of service and selflessness, and the way of the world that is Antichrist is about you getting yours and you taking yourself.
Yeah.
So, yes, we're going to explore how this is the way of Jesus. This is part of the good life. But Jesus is also saying, hey, to do the opposite is not optional if you're going to follow me. That's how important this was. Casey, today we are exploring one of the most countercultural, one of the most upside down, one of the most against the grain aspects of the way of Jesus. This practice flies in the face of modern philosophy, and yet at the same time, this practice we're discussing today is the part of Jesus' life that everyone, believer, atheist, wherever you're at, loves.
That's right, Brad. This practice is fundamental to the way of Jesus. It's like Jesus 101. It's foundational to the Christian life. The practice we're talking about is a life of service.
Welcome to episode 4 of season 3. Casey and I are here, and as you said, Casey, we're talking about a life of service. And this is Practicing the Practices, a podcast designed to help you not only learn about the way of Jesus, but integrate discipleship into your everyday life. And so, Casey, I was reading this series of articles in Psychology Today, and the title I thought was really effective and captured a bit of essence of what it's like in our modern culture as it relates to selfishness versus selflessness. And the title of the Psychology Today article was "My Country, 'Tis of Me," which of course is a play on the patriotic title, "My Country, 'Tis of Thee." And this series of articles, in this article, the author, a psychologist, was making the case that we have become a society about me. That American culture is driven by individualistic ambition that's about me, mine, and ours, and it is actually harming us. It's not a Christian, it's not a sermon. This is a psychologist, a counselor, making the case from like a secular viewpoint that we are in desperate need of a revival of selflessness over selfishness. Notably, Tom Holland, not the actor who played Spider-Man, but the renowned historian, he has made the case in his incredible book, Dominion, that what the psychologist is calling Americans to, a life of service over selfishness, is fundamentally an ethic borrowed from the life and teaching and the way of Jesus.
Yeah, I think what sets Jesus apart from so many other faiths and teachers of faith is his life of service. He really modeled, practiced what he preached. He is a teacher and a master that washed his disciples' feet. He says this in Mark chapter 10. He called them over, his disciples over, and said to them, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high position act as tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So this is essential to our faith, not only because the Bible many, many times over tells us to live this way, but because this is how our master, who we apprentice ourselves to, Jesus, lived his life. And he emulates, as we've said many times, the good life. He emulates the most fulfilling, the most joyful way to live. And I think we're going to talk about many ways that we can see it true, that service really is the good life.
And it's also really important to point out that Jesus is describing the life that you don't want. Jesus is very pointed, and he says, there's a way the Lords and the Gentiles live, which was his way of saying, there's the way those who are disconnected from me go about their life. And it's tyrannical, it's about power, it's about climbing over each other to get to the top. And he says to his disciples, this is not just the 12, but to his small band who are going to become the beginnings of the way, the church, he says, it's not going to be that way amongst you. Like, this is absolutely a line in the sand. The way of Jesus is the way of service and selflessness, and the way of the world that is antichrist is about you getting yours and you taking yourself.
Yeah.
So, yes, we're going to explore how this is the way of Jesus. This is part of the good life. But Jesus is also saying, hey, to do the opposite is not optional if you're going to follow me. That's how important this was.
Right. So as we start these next few episodes about service, we are going to really start this episode to set the foundation for why we serve, how we get this energy for service, even in times where we don't really feel like serving. Because I don't know about you, Brad, but I don't always feel like serving.
Oh, 100%.
I don't, big confession, I don't wake up every day and be like, how can I put others first today? That's just not natural.
No, that's against the grain. You wake up every day thinking, how can I make myself happy?
How can I get what I want out of this day? Right. So one of the things we really wanted to start talking about, Brad, is how service flows out of an intimate apprenticeship relationship with Jesus. This doesn't just happen by muscling through it. Something we like to talk about at our church a lot, our pathway of formation is really simple. Be with Jesus, become like him, and do what Jesus did. And all of those elements, those three elements, are really essential. If we just skip to do what Jesus did, which is service, the action kind of portion of this, we're missing it, because we're going to just be muscling through it. We're going to be doing it in our own strength. We're probably going to have a really bad experience, at least eventually, and hate it. So we don't want to just skip the being with Jesus. The work that we do in service should flow out of being with Jesus. As we become like him, it's going to be a natural overflow in our life to do what he did. So one of my husband Neil's favorite quotes is from Bernard of Clairvaux, and it says this: "If then you are wise, you will show yourself rather as a reservoir than a canal. For a canal spreads abroad water as it receives it, but a reservoir waits until it is filled before overflowing, and thus communicates without loss to itself its superabundant water. In the church at the present day, we have many canals, few reservoirs." So what that's really saying is to allow yourself to be filled with time with Jesus. And then out of the overflow of what Jesus is already doing in your life, you serve out of that place. All three of these pieces, the being with, the becoming like, and the doing what Jesus did, is really essential.
One way to think about what you're describing, Casey, is to understand service as an expression of our integrity as followers of Jesus. Now, many of you who are listening, when you hear integrity, you might associate it with character. I think it's sometimes used that way unintendedly, but what integrity really means is that there is congruence between who I say I am, what I say I believe, and what actually is. And integrity as a follower of Jesus is to be like Jesus, is to do what Jesus did. This is a life of service. So it is something that begins in the inner life, which is why we spent a lot of time in our last season talking about our inner life, talking about what it means to be changed on the inside. But the natural expression of the transformation of our inner self is that it flows into our external self, in that where we live, work, and we play, we are lead servants for Jesus. We are looking for opportunities to put our gospel on display through acts of service. Here's a great word from Jim Branch. He says, "The older I get, the more I've come to believe that ministry is much less about what we do and much more about who we are. That's the integrity piece. He goes on, I think it is intended to be something that flows freely and pours forth from what God is doing in the depths of your heart and soul, rather than something we have to manufacture or manipulate or create, thus no contriving, no forcing, no holding back. If we are living in union with God, if we are with God, if we're abiding, if we are falling more and more in love with Jesus every day, if we're becoming like Jesus, it will pour forth from our lives and it will find its ways to those in our world.
Beautifully said. I love Jim Branch. So I think that's a check for us. If I'm not serving at all and all of my spiritual life is just kind of doing inner work, that should be a check for us. Oh, time for me to kind of take what's happening in me and share it with the world. If all I'm doing is serving and I'm not really fueling myself, I'm just like a canal. I'm just kind of taking the energy I have and spreading it out, and I'm not really allowing myself to be filled. Also a check that I need to spend more time with Jesus. All of this is a really important part of the process. So another thing that we wanted to highlight about service today was kind of what you talked about with integrity, Brad, just the contrast between what we say and what we actually do. We make a lot of claims as Christians.
Yeah.
We have a lot of platitudes at times about what the life of a follower of Jesus looks like. But if we're being honest, are we really doing it? What is the scripture about the mark of true religion? Take care of the fatherless and the widow. I don't know the reference on that, but
so James 1:27, in James' big point, right? Actually, in his letter, including chapter 2, without works, faith is dead. You might even phrase that: without a life of service, your claim to this inner transformation is dead. It's lifeless. Like the whole point of this inner transformation is so that it works itself out. And he says, hey, true religion is this, like true spirituality, true discipleship. And then he describes these external realities that we are caring for the poor, that we are taking into account the widow, the orphan, and that we're like avoiding kind of this contamination from the world. Like we're resisting the world's influences, and in its place, we are infusing the world with the beauty of the life of Jesus through acts of service.
Yeah. Stephen Covey says, what you do has far greater impact than what you say. And I also love this quote by Michael Graham. Service is what prayer looks like when it gets up off his knees and walks around the world. So if your prayer is not getting up and walking around and impacting your community, again, no shame, but it's just a moment to kind of check in with the Lord. If our prayer is just for us, and it just stays in our house, what are we really doing? Kind of like James said, what are we really doing here if we're not actually serving and working in the world?
There's an old quote that I love. I don't remember who it came from, but it essentially goes like this, that the gospel flies the fastest and the furthest on the wings of love. And the idea being, we've got this message of truth that we believe. We believe that Jesus is the hope of the world. We believe that sin wrecks us. And not everyone knows that message, right? And we want to preach that message. We want to be faithful to use words to preach that message. But alongside that, we want the world to see that lived out. That the gospel is Jesus came to be near us. Emmanuel, God came to be close. He got in close. He got his feet dirty. He got associated with all sorts of people, and he served them, whether it be healing or providing them with a meal or offering words of encouragement. Like his preaching was powerful, but his preaching was not limited to his sermons that he spoke. His life preached a message. I think that's what you're getting at, is that if we just have platitudes, if we just tweet, if we're just posting, memes on Facebook about Jesus, if we just say amen to the preacher, but we're not engaged in service to our family, to our neighbors, to our enemies, then we're really missing an opportunity to put Jesus on display.
Absolutely. And I think that leads well into our next point, which is that giving of our time and our energy can actually be much harder than just giving our money. And we've done an episode on generosity, which is really fits in well with what we're talking about in the way of Jesus. But when we talk about service, a lot of times that's mostly giving our time and energy. And I know for me, it feels a lot easier to give money to something than to actually invest my time and my energy into something.
It's one of the downsides of our affluence is that we do have so much money. And I know many of the people listening don't picture themselves as rich. But if your household income is north of $37,000, you are one of the wealthiest people on planet Earth. And it is easy to write a check, to give, and to feel really good about that. And listen, that's great. That's wonderful. But it does not give us a pass from getting our hands a little dirty. Bringing our generosity and resources is really important, but also bringing our incarnational presence in service is important. God didn't just send grace from heaven, like pixie dust grace. He sent Jesus in the flesh to be present amongst the lepers, to wash Jesus took his disciples' feet in his hands. There's something about that metaphor of hands and feet, right, in the New Testament. There is something vitally necessary about us giving time, which often is precious to us, right? Many of us are busy, maybe too busy.
Right.
We're too hurried. Part of the reason that maybe we're not engaged in service or we find service to be such a burden is because we've allowed our lives to be so maxed out that service, which should be a joy-filled, life-giving, gospel-infused act, feels like drudgery because, how do I fit it in between the 87 other things, right? So, but it is important, it is necessary that we bring ourself to the act of service because you have a gift too, right? You, Casey, Ethan, everyone listening to this, you have something unique. God has bestowed you with something unique. Maybe it's a nurturing presence. Maybe you're good at coaching T-ball. Maybe you're a great teacher. Maybe you're an auto mechanic. God has given you some sort of gift, some sort of spiritual gift, but also some talents in the world, and he wants you to steward those for his glory through acts of service.
Yeah, we're going to actually talk in just a little bit about and have some time to reflect on what some of those gifts we've been given are. But before we do, just another thought about service. And I think we've touched on this already, but it's just good to remember that this is the way of humility. This is the way of Jesus. And Jesus calls himself humble and lowly in spirit. So when he washes his disciples' feet, like you mentioned, he literally took a knee, he got low, and he, the master of all, stooped down to serve the people that should be really serving him. And so that is enough of a reason for me to get, and it's uncomfortable. I don't know if Jesus felt uncomfortable washing the disciples' feet, but I've done a foot washing before, and I've receiving it and doing it to someone else. It's really uncomfortable. And I think service can be really uncomfortable. Yeah. It can be really humbling. We took our kids, our church was doing kind of a ministry, feeding of dinner to a community that is near our church. And we took our kids, and our kids were like, this is so awkward, our teenagers. And we were kind of like, good.
Yeah.
When else do you get to feel this awkwardness in your life? This is good for us to step out of our comfort zone. And it should be a little awkward, and that's okay. Awkwardness doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing this. It's probably going to be awkward. Just get yourself ready for that. And we don't have as many opportunities to step into awkward situations as we used to pre-phones, smartphones.
Well, another way to think about what you're describing so wonderfully, Casey, is service requires a certain posture. I was coaching 9-year-old baseball this week, and the head coach, he's about 6'2", big dude. He's talking to the kids, and he says, "Hey, I'm going to get down on your level." And he gets down on one knee, and so he's talking to the kids eye to eye. What he was doing was trying to create an environment where he wasn't patronizing. He wasn't up here. He wanted to look at them in the eyeball. There's a sense in which humility in the way of Jesus, we strip it of its patronizing power, of its degradation, when we realize, oh, I'm not in a lofty spot. Now, I may be blessed, I may have affluence, I may have something, but our service is not some sort of downward thing. Like, it's us getting on the ground floor with the homeless, or with a mentally challenged child, or with someone who is broken in their shame, and looking them eye to eye and saying, "Hey, we are at the same spot here.
Right.
And I'm coming to you in an act of service, not patronizing you." That's the posture of humility. And yes, it is awkward. Here's how we know it's awkward from Jesus. Is every time he did this, it made his disciples feel secondhand awkward, right?
Yeah.
He's serving a woman at the well, and they're like, "What is Jesus doing?" Right? So, yeah, if you feel that might be an indication that you're actually on the right track.
Yeah. And I think sometimes that's the thing that makes us go, well, no, this feels really awkward, so I'm not going to do that. And I think, especially like my kids' generation, anything that's awkward, they just want to avoid it. And I don't like to be awkward either, but I think that, the longer we are using smartphones and we don't have to interact with people face to face, the more we're averse. We can make things never awkward. We don't have to call and make an appointment. We don't have to, have conversations with people face to face. So it's good. It's good to put ourselves in situations where we feel a little uncomfortable, a little awkward. And I love that word, posture. Humility is the posture of service.
So, Casey, let's talk a bit about practice. All right. Where do we get started on this journey?
Well, I think where we're going to finish our episode today and start on this journey into service is with the reminder that there is a hunger in this world that you, particularly you listening right now, were specifically designed to minister to. One of my favorite quotes by Frederick Buechner says, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." I'm going to read that one more time. Maybe close your eyes if you're able and really listen to this. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. So just taking a moment as we close out today and really think, my deep gladness, not just a momentary happiness, but where do I experience deep gladness? What are the things that just bring me a satisfied joy inside? Take a moment and think about that. And then take a moment and ask God, where in my community is there a hunger for this gift you've put in me? Ask him and just see what he says. It might surprise you.
Thank you, Casey, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Practicing the Practices. Do us a favor, maybe serve us if you don't mind, and like or subscribe, give us a review. It helps more people engage with the podcast, and we hope by that means they get to engage with Jesus. Until next time, grace and peace.